Sup you beautiful people. Hope you've had a fantastic day. Welcome back to another new episode of What If Naruto was Shinobi Ashikabi. If you guys enjoy this what if, comment down below and let me know. And go ahead and check out other what ifs in the channel after watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, and also share this video with your friends. So now let's start this video. The fire spread out across the entirety of the village, burning all in its wake. The heat was intense, but it did not burn him, nor did the smoke and ash created by it fill his lungs. He looked across the expanse of the flaming village, silently thankful that there wasn't a soul in sight. He didn't want to watch his people burning. It was that dream again. Only this time, instead of walking through the village proper, Naruto found himself standing on top of the Hokage monument. A look to his left revealed the first three faces of the previous Hokages: Shodai, Nidaime, and Sandaime. On his left was the face of the Go-Daime Senjutsunade, the woman who had been like a mother to him. That meant he was standing on his father's head. If the other Hokage faces weren't enough to give it away, then the large spikes that represented his old man's hair were. Why? At the sound of the voice, Naruto turned around to find himself staring at the same man he had seen the last time, his cloak billowing in the intense updraft. He looked just as angry, or perhaps frustrated was a better word, as last time. He glared at Naruto, but the blonde had a feeling that the disgust he could see in the man's eyes were not directed at him, but at the fire user himself. Why does my Ashikabi have to be a man? It was that dream again. The same one he had last night. Naruto felt like groaning as he thought of just what that dream meant. The first time he'd had such a vivid dream, it had been because Kusano was reacting to him. Given the great detail and quality of this one, the blonde had no doubt that he was having this dream for the same reason he had dreamed of Kusano in the forest. Naruto had been hoping he was wrong, and that if he just ignored the dream, it would go away. Unfortunately, that didn't seem to be the case. What were the chances of him having the same dream in a 2-day time period? Pretty low if you asked him. The blonde did not doubt the reason for this dream was due to a Sekirei reacting to him. It was unfortunate, because this particular Sekirei did not seem all that pleased to be reacting to him in the first place. Not that Naruto could blame them, not in the least. Still, if these dreams kept up, then he knew they would be in for a most unpleasant conversation. As Naruto continued to lay there, his mind and body once more came online, and he could now determine just why he was so warm. Honestly, he wasn't surprised they had all decided to join him, even though one of them should have been sleeping in Miya's room. Despite the fact that he didn't actually need to look down to determine the reason, he did so anyways. There they were, his Sekirei were all sleeping against him. His left arm was occupied by Musubi. Naruto could not remember if he had wrapped it around her when they had gone to sleep, or done so sometime in the middle of the night. Either way, she was much closer to him than last time. A feat in and of itself, considering just how clingy the excitable Sekirei was. He was also surprised she was able to get so close without her chest getting in the way, considering just how large her bust was. The brunette had burrowed herself directly into his torso, and her chest was literally mashed up against his so tightly they looked like a set of balloons that were about to burst. Unlike the last time, where she had been using Naruto's chest as her pillow, this time her head was resting on his shoulder. It was a wonder the appendage she was using hadn't fallen asleep. If Naruto were honest, she looked quite adorable while sleeping. And yes, just like last time, Musubi was drooling on his bare skin. Akitsu was on his other side. While, much like Musubi, his arm had wrapped itself around her sometime during the night, the snow woman was in a much different position than number 88. Because Akitsu was a few centimeters taller than Musubi, she could not use his shoulder as a pillow. Instead, her chest was being pushed partly against his shoulder and partly against his chest, while her head was resting within the crook of his neck. Naruto felt himself shiver slightly as the ice user breathed on him, her breath chilly like a cool winter breeze. Despite how cold it was, the feel of her exhales on the bare skin of his neck were not unpleasant. Unlike the last time Naruto had gone to sleep, Akitsu and Musubi were not the only Sekirei who had chosen to partake in sleeping with him. Natsu had also decided to join in on the festivities. Seeing as how Naruto had run out of limbs to claim, the glasses-wearing Sekirei had chosen to sleep on top of him, which would explain why his breathing felt slightly constricted. She was sprawled out directly on top of his torso, lying half off of him, as she continued to snooze while using his chest as a pillow. To be honest, the position didn't look that comfortable, and Naruto was not quite sure how she could actually sleep like that. Then again, if she was as dedicated of a hacker as he assumed she was, then Natsu was probably used to sleeping while sitting up, a position that was even more uncomfortable than her current one. It was the last member that Naruto found to be the most intriguing. Unlike his other three Sekirei, Kusano had not gone to sleep with him last night, but went to bed in Miya's room. He should know, he had tucked her in and read her story after all. It looked like she had snuck out of the landlady's room sometime during the middle of the night in order to sleep with him. Naruto was not quite sure how the little sprite managed to pull such a thing off. Surely someone of Mia's caliber would have noticed a little girl sneaking out of her bedroom at night. But then, maybe Mia had let her go so that she could tease him the next morning about corrupting children with his lustful urges. That would be just like her. Currently, the little blonde was sleeping at the foot of his bed, wearing a cute pair of orange pajamas, long-sleeve top and bottom, that Naruto had bought for her due to their color. Orange is still the color of the gods as far as he is concerned. She was curled up like a cat as she used his legs as a pillow, taking a page from Usubi's book as she drooled on his legs. While her head was resting on him, the rest of her body was on the memory foam mattress of the bed. Naruto found himself very pleased to have decided to go with an actual bed, rather than the more traditional futon, and that the bed was rather large, the queen's size. Otherwise he was sure the girl would be quite uncomfortable, since she would have been forced to actually sleep on top of him. Like always, Usubi and Akitsu were wearing their standard choice of sleepwear. Usubi was in her bloomers and was not wearing a bra, as Naruto could easily attest to with the way her nipples were rubbing against him. And Akitsu was wearing one of his shirts, a Star Wars shirt it looked like. And once again, he noticed with more amusement than anything else, she was not wearing any panties. Surprisingly enough, the one that he believed was the most perverted of his harem was wearing surprisingly conservative sleepwear. The clothing she had chosen to sleep in was a semi-sheer light pink teddy with thin spaghetti straps going around her shoulders. It was cut to about mid-thigh, an oddly modest length for the red head, and beneath that was a standard set of white bra and panties. It was a touch seduction and could, in some cases, be considered risque, but it was far less immodest than what he had originally expected from his new Sekirei. For a moment, Naruto wondered what he should do about this situation. It wasn't uncomfortable by any means, quite the opposite in fact. The warmth of his Sekirei surrounding him was almost enough to put them back to sleep. But at the same time, Naruto's mind wasn't very comfortable with the idea of letting his Sekirei get so close. Hadn't he been trying to keep his distance from them, to avoid the pain their death would cause? Naruto was sure he had learned his lesson, but it seemed he was wrong. Let them into your heart, and I can guarantee you won't regret doing so. Mia's words from yesterday rang across his mind, causing the blonde's previous thoughts to half dead in their tracks, and his eyes to close in contemplation. That's right, he had already made up his mind about that, hadn't he? He had already decided that even if these bonds were a temporary reprieve from his own anguish, they would still be worth forming. If he really was going to go through with this, then he might as well start truly getting used to it. Letting his stiff body relax, Naruto settled back into the comfortable embrace of his Sekirei. He decided he could stay where he was for a little while longer, at least until the sun started to rise. Zox. It wasn't until the sun began to shine through his window that Naruto decided to get up. Not wanting to wake his Sekirei, the blonde made ingenious use of the Kawarimi no Jutsu, substitution technique, to replace himself with Usubi, who was the heaviest sleeper of the four. After that it was easy enough for him to get dressed in a pair of dark sweatpants, a sleeveless orange muscle shirt, and the custom-made ninja sandals he had made for him in France. After taking one last look at his four Sekirei as they cuddled into each other, a sight which would have made lesser men dying from blood loss, the blonde silently slipped out of his room. It was easy to make his way down the hall without waking anyone. His steps were done in complete silence, a small cushion of chakra being channeled to the bottom of his feet in order to avoid making the floor creak. It was an old trick, one that he had learned from Kakashi before the man had been killed by Tobi. Across the hall, down the stairs, and past several sets of shoji screen doors, Naruto eventually found himself standing outside in the courtyard. He looked around for a moment. For the first time his eyes were judging the place to see if it would be suitable for his own training purposes. The yard was large, definitely large enough for him to practice the basics, which was really all he planned on doing for the moment. It was lacking in a few things, such as training dummies for target practice, and practice dummies for him to hit, but those weren't necessarily needed for what he wanted to do right now. He could always buy them later on as well, if he truly found out he needed them. There wasn't much else to the yard other than what he saw. The place would only be good for him to practice his taijutsu and perhaps his weapons training, but nothing more than that. Naruto wouldn't be able to practice training the elements or his ninjutsu. That suited him just fine though. Naruto had no intention of practicing ninjutsu out in the open. With the recent advances in technology, and Minako already having more knowledge of him than he should, the last thing Naruto wanted was for the man to see him shooting fireballs and wind bullets from his mouth via spy satellite. Closing his eyes, Naruto inhaled a deep breath, and with its exhale set himself in a stance that was as familiar to him as his own body. Kawazukumite, the frog kata that had been taught to him by Fukasaku-sama, or Pa, as he was often called by Naruto and the toads of Mount Maibakizan. The fighting style itself was one that could only be used by those who had completely mastered Sanin-moto. It was a style derived by the toads in order to utilize the Senjutsu chakra used when in Sanin-moto to its fullest potential. Thanks to the incredible physical enhancements in speed, strength, stamina, and durability, while in Sanin-moto, the sage utilizing the Kawazukumite style of taijutsu would be capable of performing incredible feats, which included such things as leaping great distances, shattering sharp materials with nothing more than their bare hands, and lifting objects several times their size and weight. Perhaps the greatest ability of this style of taijutsu, however, was the ability for the sage to extend the senjutsu chakra out of their body and wield it as an extension of their self. When using Kawazukumite, the natural energy used by the practitioner to create senjutsu chakra also encapsulates the user as an aura of natural energy. This aura can act as an extension of their body and cannot be seen by anyone other than those who have trained in senjutsu. By utilizing the aura, the user can extend the range and force of their physical attacks. In other words, strikes that would seemingly or would normally miss will actually make contact with their target. Even one punch from someone utilizing both the Kawazukumite and Senjutsu chakra was often a debilitating blow, either crippling or killing an opponent. At the moment Naruto was not wielding the fabled Senjutsu chakra of Sanin-moto, merely practicing the forms he had been taught by Fukasaku-sama after learning how to properly wield Senjutsu chakra. He didn't need to use Sanin-moto at the moment, merely wishing to regain the skill at which he had been capable of bringing to bear while using the Kawazukumite. The fight against Yomi had shown Naruto just how much he had lost due to his inactivity and lack of strong opponents. While he might have more power than he ever did during the Fourth Great Shinobi War, his skills when it came to combat had obviously grown rusty. It was time to remove that rust. Though it became clear to Naruto as soon as he started his kata that his skills were indeed rusty from so many thousands of years of disuse, the movements themselves were still familiar. His body was able to easily tell when he was doing something wrong, simply by how his stances and movements felt, allowing him to make the appropriate corrections. It was like relearning how to ride a bike after not having done so for a long time, or taking up a sport again after getting back from rehab due to a near debilitating injury. While nowhere near as talented in this style as he once was, the moves were there, and it would be much easier for him to relearn the second time around. He let himself fall into the flow of the style, increasing and decreasing both the pace and power as needed. Naruto didn't use chakra, not for this. He had no need to increase his speed or attack power, he merely needed to re-familiarize himself with the style. Once he regained his edge, then he could work on increasing the sharpness of that edge. An hour into his practice and the blonde began to feel comfortable enough in the style that he could let his mind wander. He would know when he was doing something wrong, his body would tell him. He let his thoughts move over to the strategy session he'd held with Matsu last night. He had learned quite a lot about Sekirei, where they came from, how Hiroto Minaka found them, and managed to create MBI in such a short time, the first formation of the disciplined squad, Takedo, and the S-Plan, that had been created to protect Kamakura Island during the unaffiliated army invasion. Yes, Naruto had learned quite a bit, and even a bit more than just that. Unfortunately, Naruto still didn't know a whole lot about Sekireis in general, beyond the bit he gained last night and what he had already known. For example, he still knew nothing about the bond that Sekirei formed with their Ashikabi, not how it was formed, why they formed it, or how it was even possible for two apparently completely separate species to form such a bond in the first place. When he had asked about it, all Matsu had done was give him this blank look, as if she had not understood a single word he told her. Still, at least Naruto did have a bit of a better understanding of Sekireis in general. The physiology of a Sekirei was, in fact, surprisingly similar to a human's. Granted, that much was fairly obvious when looking at them, even Naruto would not be able to tell a Sekirei apart from a human at first glance. However, while Sekirei were very similar to humans, they were also vastly different. All Sekirei possessed greater physical abilities than a human did. Even when comparing a Sekirei to the shinobi of his era, they had greater potential and raw power. Well, for the most part. From what Naruto had seen so far, all Sekirei were above the average jonin when it came to raw power, and a few were above the power of a Kage, but not all of them were. To make things more clear, Matsu was fairly weak power-wise, ranking at about what he would expect from someone of Hinata's caliber. Even then Matsu wasn't a combat specialist, and couldn't gain the raw skill needed to match Hinata. Yomi on the other hand, the Sekirei he had fought, had about the same amount of power that Kakashi had. Before his death Kakashi had been an S-rank ninja, a rank that only a few ever got to. S-rank ninja were those who were strong enough to be considered Kage level, but were not Kages. In terms of power, Kakashi would have been on the lower end of the totem pole in the Kage ranking. He hadn't had that much chakra thanks to his Sharingan, but he had made up for it with his incredible talent and skill. These two were about what Naruto would call average Sekirei. Yumi might have had some power, but it did not match up to some of the other Sekirei he had met. In comparison, Usopp had loads of raw power to her, more so than many of the Sekirei he had met so far. In fact, at the moment, the only Sekirei he knew that had more power than she did was Hamura Kagari, Akitsu, and Miya. She was far above the average Jonin in terms of raw power, and with training could become even more powerful. Kagari and Akitsu were even stronger than the fist fighter was, both in terms of power and in terms of skill. Naruto wasn't quite sure where he would place them on the scale when comparing them to the ninja he had fought, but they had more power than the Sandai Mirai Kage, a frightening thought indeed. Miya was in a class of her own. Naruto highly doubted there was another Sekirei out there with as much power as her, which he considered to be a very good thing. The last thing the blonde wanted was to end up fighting someone with that much raw power to them, especially if they had the skill to back it up. However, while Sekirei were far above the power of even the humans of his era, there were a number of similarities besides looks. Their organs, for one. Comparing the human body to the body of a Sekirei, which showed that the two were identical in every way possible: organs, bone structure, muscles, bodily functions. Sure, the organs were a little tougher, the bones a little denser, and the muscles a little stronger, but the structure was the same. They also had the same requirements necessary in order to keep their bodies functioning at optimum levels. They still needed to eat food, drink water, and breathe air. It was all possible for Sekirei to reproduce with an Ashikabi, something that Matsu had been very enthusiastic about telling him. Naruto was not quite sure that was a good thing, but figured it was definitely something he would need to know for when he and one of his Sekirei got together. These were the major similarities between a human and a Sekirei. However, there was one part of a Sekirei that no human had that was very important to their physiology: the Sekirei core. Naruto didn't know much about the core. Matsu wouldn't tell him. All he knew was that the Sekirei core was tied into the Sekirei crest on their back, and that a Sekirei who lost their core would cease functioning. Even though Matsu had not told him much, Naruto had been able to come up with his own theory on just what a Sekirei core was. Using his own chakra network as a comparison, Naruto was certain that the core was similar, and that it was the source of the Sekirei's power. It was through this core that they were able to pull their own inner power out, and utilize it to perform the incredible feats of strength and elemental manipulation he had seen thus far. He also theorized that it was the core that drew on the power of their Ashikabi when they kissed, and the crest on their back was the symbol they gained when they bonded to their Ashikabi. At least, that's what he had gotten from the explanation. He could be wrong, or he could be missing pieces. In fact, Naruto was certain that his theory was too simple, but he was also positive that he was at least heading in the right direction. He had also been able to come up with a very basic theory on what made an Ashikabi. The answer was as simple as it was basic: chakra. All humans had chakra, and it was chakra that a Sekirei drew from their Ashikabi when forming a bond or using their Narutos. Therefore, it stood to reason that chakra had something to do with what made a human an Ashikabi. Of course, Naruto did not quite know how chakra related to the Ashikabi. It could have been something as simple as they had more chakra, so they even had the capability of using it if trained properly. It was a plausible theory, he knew, and it would make sense that there were still a few humans who could use chakra. But he had yet to truly put that theory to the test. By this point in time, the sun had finally risen above the horizon, and Naruto had worked up quite a sweat. His shirt was caked to his body now, and his pants were beginning to rub uncomfortably against him. Small droplets of salty liquid flew off his form with each movement he made. Every kick, every punch, every leap, and every maneuver caused tiny speckles of water to fly off him. He must have been working for at least 2 or 3 hours. His currently unenhanced muscles were beginning to get sore. A loud and overjoyed squeak noise snapped Naruto out of both his thoughts and his movements. Blinking, the blonde shinobi turned to see that all of his Sekirei, Miya, and Uzumaki were all awake and watching him. Akitsu was looking at him with the same blank expression on her face as always, though she did have a slight blush on her cheeks. His littlest Sekirei was looking at him with excitement, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at him while making a G noise. Uzumaki was staring at him in surprise, her mouth slightly parted as she blinked at him with a stupid expression on her face. While at first Naruto thought that it might have been Kusano who had spoken, that belief was shoved down the drain when he saw Usopp. The close combat fighter of his group was holding her hands under her chin as she stared at him with stars in her eyes. The girl's shoulders were literally shaking with excitement, and Naruto was worried the poor might get a seizure if she didn't calm down. Of course, Musubi's spastic movements were not the weirdest action his Sekirei were taking. Natsu topped that, what with the way her glasses gleamed ominously in the morning light, that creepy perverted smile on her face, and the pervy old man giggling along with the grasping motions her hands were making. It was like looking at a female Jiraiya, and that was just all kinds of creepy. Of course, even Natsu's level of freakiness was not enough to hold his attention for long. Not in the face of the expression that the most powerful being he knew besides himself was giving him. It was Mia's look that caught Naruto's attention the most. She had both of her eyes open, and was studying him like some kind of lab rat that had just done something incredibly surprising. The eyes she possessed were sharp, the look of an extremely skilled warrior as they studied and tried to break down the style she was using. Though it was clear she had a hard time breaking down his taijutsu, not that such a thing surprised him. This style was designed and made specifically for use with senjutsu chakra, and while it could also be incredibly effective if he enhanced his performance with chakra, alone it didn't look like much. At least, not to those untrained in combat. While it was clear that Mia was unable to determine how his style worked, equally clear was that she recognized it as deadly. He would have expected nothing less from the first Sekirei to have awakened from hibernation. Putting on a smile, Naruto decided he had done enough training for now, and walked over to the porch everyone was standing on. "Good morning Yuka-eyes, girls," he corrected, then blinked when he looked over at Musubi, and noticed that the girl was starting to turn red. Had she actually gotten so caught up in her excitement that she had forgotten to breathe? "Breath, Musubi-chan," he told her. "Deep breaths, in and out, we don't want you passing out on us." It was almost amusing to watch as the girl did just as suggested, taking a huge gulp of air, before releasing it in a large gust, then repeating. Still, it didn't take the girl long to recover from her lack of oxygen, and when she did the girl practically burst. "Naruto-sama," she shouted as she ran directly in front of him with sparkles in her eyes. "That was amazing, you have to spar with me." Naruto gave the girl an easy grin and began chuckling a little. Really, this girl was like an odd combination between himself and Rock Lee when they were younger. He was only glad this girl had yet to come up with her own catchword, or start wearing green spandex, and spouting on about the flames of youth. Granted, she seemed to espouse love, but that was nowhere near as bad as hearing two grown men shouting about their youth at the top of their lungs and sunset genjutsus. Gotta be thankful for the little things in life. "Maybe when I get back into fighting shape," Naruto suggested, wincing a bit as he shifted his weight from his left foot onto his right. Yep, he was definitely out of shape. No doubt it was only thanks to his cursed chakra that his body retained its muscles and hadn't atrophied. Still though, even if his muscles hadn't diminished in the slightest, it was clear they were no longer used to being used in such a manner. It would take quite a bit of work in order for them to regain the dexterity they had in the past. "Oh man, just look at those hard muscles on that hot, sweaty body," Natsu giggled perversely, as her hands came up and her fingers began wiggling. It was an action he had seen Jiraiya do many times, and one that, while disturbing, Naruto did his best to ignore. Phew, Natsu's really looking forward to doing some research with Naruto-tan. Uzumaki glanced at the redhead next to her, before shaking her head and turning a grin towards Naruto. That was quite the show you put on bro," she told him. "Though it looked a little odd to me," the girl admitted with a tilt of her head. Naruto shrugged. "I imagine it would probably look odd to most people. That style of fighting is a lot different than any other form you will see in this world, and seeing as I'm the only practitioner of the style now. It is a most unusual style," Mia chimed in as she continued to look at him. "Is it self-taught?" "No," Naruto said, shaking his head as his mind went back to the past. "That style was taught to me by one of my senseis a number of years ago. Fukasaku-sama was a very powerful man, and he was so in tune with nature that he created this style in an effort to become one with it. It was both a carefully crafted lie, as well as the truth. Fukasaku-sama had created the style and he was powerful, however, he was not human, and the style had been created to supplement his abilities with senjutsu chakra, not the other way around." Naruto wasn't quite ready to tell anyone the truth about his past, and he doubted he would be for some time to come. "He must have been very important to Uzumaki-kun, from the way you talk about him," Mia noted, her critical gaze leaving her for one of her gentle smiles. "He was," Naruto admitted, letting his own fond memories of his time on Mount Maiboku training with the toads. He hadn't gone back there since Gamakichi had died. Shaking his head, the blonde looked over at Mia and continued speaking. "Fukasaku-sama was one of the strongest people I knew, which is saying something cause he was really old, as in, really, really old." As Mia raised a hand to her mouth and began to giggle, and Uzumaki started snickering, Naruto glanced over at Musubi to see that the girl was looking kind of depressed, her shoulders slumped as she looked down at the ground. No doubt sad that he didn't want to spar with her. Usubi-chan, he said, causing the girl to look up. How about you give me a month to get back into shape, and then we can have our spar. He offered, absently calculating how long it would take his body to regain its fighter's edge. Initially, it hadn't taken very long for him to learn the Kawazu Kumite, about 3 days all total. However, that wasn't the only skill Naruto needed to work on. There were a number of other skills, including the fighting style he normally used that had been developed by him and Jiraiya that he would need to relearn, not including the modifications he had made to the style during the war. All told, he felt it would take a month for his body to regain at least some of the edge he had lost. Okay? Usubi said with a bright smile, before pumping her fist in the air and crowing triumphantly. I can't wait for my spar with you, Naruto-sama. She told him eagerly, her eyes shining at the prospect of a spar with her Ashikabi. Naruto sighed, before putting on a resigned smile. I'm sure you can't, he told her. Zox. Naruto smiled happily as he put the finishing touches on the breakfast he was making, a more traditional Japanese breakfast of steamed rice, miso soup with tofu, chopped green onions, wacom seaweed and fish cakes, natto that had been lightly seasoned with soy sauce, nori dipped in soy sauce, and rolled up with some rice, tamagoyaki, and broiled salted salmon. It was a fairly large breakfast, enough to feed a small army of Akimichi. Considering how much his Sekirei ate and the fact that he was starving from his workout just an hour earlier, Naruto predicted this food would be gone within the hour. Wanna help me bring the dishes to the table, Ku? Asked Naruto as he looked down at the tiny blonde that had requested demanded to help him make breakfast. He hadn't let the small Sekirei do much, namely because she was not only so small, but also because she was too young to use some of the equipment responsibly. The last thing he needed was for the girl to cut herself using one of the knives to peel or chop vegetables. That didn't mean he didn't let the girl do anything to help. Naruto had managed to find a stool for the girl to use, so she could wash the vegetables that he would cut. Thankfully, that seemed to be enough for the little sprite. Ever since the incident with Matsu, the blonde had become quite fearful of the plant Sekirei's teeth. The girl had a mean set of molars. Kusano looked up at him with a beaming smile that only she and Usubi, the childish of his harem, could ever hope to produce, and nodded her head. "Okay," she said, grabbing the plate of nori that Naruto offered her. As the little girl began walking towards the living room, Naruto grabbed a tray with the bowls of miso soup on them, and looked over at the other Sekirei in the room with him. As always, Akitsu acted as his silent shadow, standing behind him like she often did. By now he had grown quite used to the ice user's strange ways. He had even started finding her presence somewhat comforting. "Would you mind setting these on the table, Akitsu-chan?" he asked, holding out the tray of soup to her. Akitsu nodded and just as slowly held her hands out to take the tray of soup. "Yes," she said, gently holding onto the tray as she turned around and began her slow trek to the living room. Deciding he could take the rest in one go, Naruto grabbed the rest of the food himself, using his incredible sense of balance, as well as a small application of chakra, to keep everything from falling, as he began following after the pair. He probably looked ridiculous, Naruto thought with a snort, balancing 6 empty plates in his left hand, and 6 empty rice bowls stacked on top of those, the tray of broiled salmon in his right, 6 bowls of miso soup along his left arm, with the smaller bowls of Naruto on each finger, and a large bowl of steamed rice on his head. As he walked into the living room where Kusano had just put her the plate of food she had in the center of the table, Uzume turned to look at him and covered her mouth to hold in her laughter. It seemed that she thought he looked funny as well. "See something that amuses you, Uzume?" asked Naruto as he began setting down the plates and dishes in his hands. By the time he had fully entered the room, Akitsu had just placed her tray on the table, and was now in the process of setting them at the places where the others would eat. Like always, her process was slow, consisting of her staring at the dish for a few seconds, before deciding which spot the dish would be set, and placing it there most carefully. "Not at all," Uzume said with a grin, her shoulders shaking lightly with mirth. "I just couldn't help but notice how good you are at doing things around the house. Cooking, cleaning, setting the table, you can even bring in all of the dishes, while balancing them as you walk." She ticked off all of his accomplishments on her fingers. "You'd make a great house husband." "Well gee, thanks for that," Naruto replied with slight sarcasm as he put her plate in front of her. "It makes me feel so warm and fuzzy to know that you think that." "Just trying to keep your spirits up," Uzume replied with a smile. The blonde rolled his eyes before deciding that he wasn't going to let the star-wearing Sekirei get the last laugh. "Just remember, Uzume," he said as he stood back up and looked down at her with a bright smile. "You shouldn't tease the person who's making your food. You never know what they may do to it the next time they cook for you." "Eh?" Uzume blinked as Naruto began walking away. "Wait, you don't mean that, do you, bro?" "I was only kidding." she shouted after him, causing Naruto to chuckle as he walked out towards the courtyard, where the sounds of intense sparring could be heard. That girl was 1,000 years too soon to beat him when it came to pranks and word games of any kind. Oh, how he had missed messing with others. As Naruto stepped onto the veranda overlooking the courtyard, Naruto eyed the spar that was now taking place there. After finishing his katas, Musubi and Miya had taken up the space for their own training, while he made breakfast. Though it would be much more accurate to say that Miya was training Musubi, the Lavenderette didn't even look like she was trying, as she fought the enthusiastic fist fighter. Naruto took a second to watch the pair battling it out. It was impressive to see the difference in Musubi's fighting since the last time he had watched her. While still nowhere close to Miya's level of talent, the girl was improving by leaps and bounds. He watched as they went through a particular sequence they must have been practicing for some time. With only a single step, Miya leapt into the air, her still sheathed sword held above her head. Down below, Musubi's feet shifted into a more solid stance, and her hands came up in preparation for her next move. Naruto could easily see what they were trying to do, just as easily as he could see that Musubi wouldn't be able to catch the blade like she was attempting. She may have the speed, but she just didn't have the reflexes yet to time her reactions so precisely. Much like Naruto had predicted, Miya came down and swung her blade, while Musubi raised her hands and clapped them together. The hands missed the sheathed weapon by a good margin, several centimeters at least, and continued on to smack the girl on the head. Ouch! Musubi yelped as her hands went to tenderly hold her head, where Naruto could see a large lump beginning to grow on it. As she rubbed her head, Miya gave the excitable Sekirei a gentle smile, moving her sheathed blade back into its usual position of being held at her side. "Why don't we stop for now and take a break?" she suggested, her eyes moving over to where Naruto was still watching them. "It looks like Uzumaki-kun has finished making breakfast anyways." "Ah, Naruto-sama." Musubi turned to face him, her hands moving until they were clasped in front of her in such a way that they pushed her breasts up. "Hello." Naruto shook his head. If it weren't for the fact that he knew the girl so well, he would have been sure she was doing that on purpose. However, the fist type was far too naive to actually do something like pushing her chest together to entice him on purpose. That was more something he would expect from Matsu. "Musubi-chan, Miya-chan," he greeted the pair, before focusing the majority of his attention on his own Sekirei. Aside from the lump on her head, which had now grown to the size of a goose egg, she had several scratches and bruises from where she had tripped or been hit. Her clothes had also gotten filthy, with numerous scuff marks all over them, and large stains of sweat that caked the clothing to her body. "It looks like our very capable landlady has been working you hard. After breakfast you're going to have to take a bath." "Okay." Musubi replied to the blonde, before turning to Miya and giving the woman a bow. "Thank you very much for the spar," she said with a bright smile. "I look forward to our next one." Miya raised her free hand to her mouth and giggled. "I as well," she replied gracefully, then she began moving. "Now come on, it's time for breakfast. I'll draw you a bath afterwards." "Okay." Naruto must have been watching Musubi's and Miya's spar for longer than he had realized. By the time he and the two females had entered the living room, Matsu was already there, sitting next to Uzume at the table with her hands in her lap. Uzume and Kusano must have gotten bored waiting for them, because the two were currently making faces at each other. Shaking his head, the blonde walked further into the room with Miya and Musubi following behind him. Miya started with a smile on her face as she watched the Sekirei and the star shirt grab her cheeks and stretch them out while sticking out her tongue. "It looks like you two are having fun today," she said, sitting down at her place at the table. Uzume chuckled as she rubbed the back of her head. "I was just trying to keep Ku from eating the food. You know, 'cause I'm responsible like that." It was apparent that while Kusano probably didn't know what responsible meant, she had clearly understood the small jab against her attempts at eating the food. Her face took on a very childish pout as she glared at the busty young woman, a loud phew sound escaping her throat. "The day Uzume-chan actually starts acting responsible is the day pigs will finally learn how to fly," Naruto stated as he sat down next to Akitsu and Kusano. Almost as soon as he did, the slight rattling of Akitsu's chains greeted him as she shifted in her seat, so she could continue watching him. Over on the other side of the table, Uzume winced playfully at the jab to her usual immaturity. "Ouch, bro. That was kinda harsh, don't you think?" she asked, jutting out her lower lip as she stared at the blonde. "Not in the slightest," Naruto replied as he took Kusano's plate and loaded her up with some food. The green girl beamed to demand, with spoon and fork in her hands, began munching on the food she and her Wani-chan made. Over at the head of the table, Miya raised a hand to her mouth and giggled, while Uzume huffed and turned her head the other way. Hu, Matsu decided to get in on the fun as she laughed her old man laugh next to Uzume. "Claws out today, Naruto-tan?" she asked, smiling behind her glasses. You seem to be a lot less reserved than you have been since arriving in Shinto Tito. And you would know that how? Asked Naruto, before blinking in surprise as if he had just realized the answer to his own question. Oop, wait, I forgot that Matsu sends a peeper. The amount of giggling coming from Mia increased as Matsu huffed and puffed out her cheeks in a childish manner. It's not peeping, she complained, crossing her arms under her chest. It's called Eye of the Electronic Brain. And don't you get started on this too, Naruto-tan. I have enough problems dealing with Mia-tan. Oh my, Mia giggled, her eyes crinkling shut as she smiled pleasantly. I apologize, Matsu-san, I had no idea you felt that your peeping was so special. Matsu huffed as both Naruto and Mia shared a chuckle at the redhead's expense. Uh-oh, Uzume mumbled under her breath as she watched the blonde and Lavenderette laughing. Those two actually getting along doesn't look like it will bode well for any of us. What was that, Uzume-san? Asked Mia, smiling over at the brunette with a slightly darkening aura. Nothing, Mia, Uzume stuttered, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't say anything, did you hear me say anything? Nope, nothing bad was said about you or the bro over here, he-ha. As Uzume released her nervous laughter, Mia continued staring at the other Sekirei and making her increasingly more nervous. Eventually, however, the Lavenderette turned, apparently satisfied that she had still managed to scare the girl, even though she was no longer using her Hanya mask, thanks to Naruto. Uzume, on the other hand, sighed in relief at getting off so easily. You two are getting along way too well for my tests, Matsu grumbled, seemingly agreeing with Uzume, as she focused her childish glare at the two that had decided to poke fun of her, before she pointed to Naruto. And you still haven't answered my question. Well, technically you didn't ask one, Naruto replied with a smile. However, when he saw Matsu's right eye begin to twitch, he leaned back on his hands and sighed. I guess, you could say that I had a change of heart, he said, looking over at Mia, who caught his gaze and smiled. He gave her a slightly weaker one in return, before serving up both the Kitsu, Musubi, Matsu and himself. Truth be told, Naruto was still unsure about this whole thing. However, after talking with Mia last night, and thinking over her words well into the night until he had fallen asleep, he had decided that he would at least give this whole Sekirei bonding to an Ashikabi thing a shot. He didn't know how well he would do, nor did he know if he could truly love them, but he had decided that if there was even a chance for it to happen, then he would let it happen. Besides, it wouldn't be fair to his girls if he didn't let them in. They were bonded to him, and so the least he could do for them was make an effort at letting them get closer. Is that so? Asked Matsu, frowning as Naruto placed a plate of salmon in front of her, then filled up the bowl of rice. Yep, Naruto replied, sitting back after he finished serving her up. I've decided to give this whole Ashikabi thing a shot, which reminds me. He separated his chopsticks with a snap and looked over at the redhead with a more critical gaze. How long do you think it would take for you to start making profiles on all of the Sekirei and their Ashikabis? He asked, bringing a slight halt to the light-hearted atmosphere of the meals. Uzume stiffened in her seat and stared at him warily, while Mia had straightened up and was now looking at him with both eyes open. Musubi and Kusano had almost identical looks of confusion, tilting their heads to the side, as they likely tried to figure out why he would want to know about other Sekirei and their Ashikabis. Even Akitsu had shifted, the familiar clinking of her chains resounding in his ears. Matsu blinked and stopped her hands just as she was about to put some rice in her mouth. Removing her chopsticks from her oral passage, she looked over at Naruto with a slight frown. I can understand why Naruto-tan would want to know about the Sekirei, but why do you want to know about their Ashikabis as well? Because apparently some of the Ashikabis have become big players in the Sekirei clan, Naruto stated, his mind going back to his conversation with that secretary guy he had never gotten the name of. If the guy he worked for, Izumi Higa, was called the Ashikabi of the East, then it meant there had to be other Ashikabi who had gained a similar title. There also had to be a West, a South and a North, and each one of them were likely big-time players in the Sekirei clan that had more Sekirei than the average Ashikabi. It wouldn't be smart on his part to just ignore these potentially dangerous people. There was also the fact that he would need information on his enemies if they were going to win this. From what he had learned last night, every Sekirei was technically an enemy of every other Sekirei. Eventually, all of them would be forced into battle until there was only one Sekirei left standing. If he wanted his Sekirei to win, then he would need all of the information he could get to ensure they didn't lose. And finally, there was the issue with Higa. The man knew more about him than Naruto liked, and in return Naruto knew next to nothing about him. Going into a meeting with a man who held all the cards while he held none was not a smart situation. No matter what the outcome of their meeting was, Naruto wanted to be the one who walked away with the better deal. So Naruto-tan wants me to gather information on the larger players of the Sekirei clan. Asked Matsu for confirmation, adjusting her glasses as she studied him. It would be a good idea to know about people like that, she admitted with a smile. It seems that Naruto-tan is finally getting into this Sekirei business. Naruto smiled at the redhead's compliment, but then shook his head at her answer. No, he started, his eyes staring into hers. I want information on all of the Sekirei and their Ashikabi. Everyone who is participating in the Sekirei plan, not just the larger players. Well, they're the ones I want you to focus on at first. It would be irresponsible to overlook someone, just because they may not be as powerful as someone like Hige of the East. No one but Naruto seemed to notice the way Uzumaki stiffened at the name, busy as they were staring at him. He made a note that it might be in his best interest to speak with Uzumaki at a later point in time. Shaking his head, he focused back on Matsu, who was looking apprehensive. So how long do you think it will take? He asked. Well, Matsu looked over at Mia, then coughed nervously and turned her attention back to him. It could take quite a while, and I'm not all that sure I'll be able to give you information on every Sekirei that's out there. Naruto narrowed his eyes, his pupils shifting between Matsu and Mia. Why not? He asked with a frown. Did Mia not want him to know that she was the first Sekirei? No, that couldn't be it. She had already admitted to him that she was a Sekirei, and she had to know that he was smart enough to connect the dots with the information Matsu had given him last night. And if that wasn't the case, then it meant there were likely more secrets she was still keeping that she didn't want to get out. Look, just trust me when I say that there are some things that are better left unsaid, Matsu told him, causing Naruto's frown to increase. His new Sekirei must have seen this because she was quick to begin speaking again. I can still get you most of the information, there just might be a few gaps in it, she explained. Naruto sighed as he resumed eating to give himself a moment of time to think. On the one hand, he really didn't like not knowing everything about this situation. During the war, it had been a lack of information that had killed off most of his friends, and while this Sekirei plan didn't seem anywhere near as bad as the Fourth Great Shinobi War, or even some of the wars humanity had waged near constantly, losing still meant that he would be separated from his Sekirei. And he wouldn't be a good Ashikabi if he allowed that to happen. And yet, didn't Naruto have his own secrets? Sure, he had decided that maybe letting these girls into his life wouldn't be all bad, but that didn't mean he was going to just come out and tell them every little secret he had. Naruto had more skeletons in his closet than every single government of the world combined. Hell, some of those secrets they had were incidents that involved him when the secret of his existence had been put in jeopardy. Was it really right for him to deny Mia her secrets when he himself had so many? Much as he hated to admit it, the answer was no, it wasn't right. I understand, he said at last, gesturing with a nod towards Matsu, though his eyes were focused on Mia. While Matsu slumped in relief, the beautiful landlady was looking right at him, and clearly understood that his words had been more for her benefit than the redhead's. She offered him a nod and smiled that he acknowledged, before turning back to his new Sekirei. Can you still get me most of those profiles then? Yes, Matsu nodded. Whenever a Sekirei gets winged, MBI collects information on their partners and stores it in their database. That made sense, Naruto thought to himself. If MBI stored all data on an Ashikabi the moment they winged a Sekirei, it would explain how Minaka had managed to find a way past the reroute Naruto had placed on his cell phone. With MBI's technology, they had likely been able to collect more data on him than anybody else, and by winging Usubi, he had given them that opening to do so. He grimaced a bit at that knowledge, wondering if perhaps winging Usubi was the reason MBI had found him so easily. So what kind of information do they collect? Asked Naruto. Is it something simple like their names and phone numbers? Or do they gain more like their age, occupation, place of residence, or even a biography? And what about their Sekirei? Would it be possible for you to get me a list of their statistics and powers? Wait, Naruto-tan, Matsu interrupted the blonde before he could really start going. She looked like the barrage of questions he had been asking caught her off guard. The redhead had to actually take a few seconds to herself before answering his question. I honestly couldn't say what kind of information I can get you. The database I hacked into seemed to hold some basic information on both the Ashikabi and their Sekirei. Just tell me which ones you want and I can get them for you. As I said, I want all of them, Naruto told her. However, I want you to start with any Ashikabi who has managed to wing more than one Sekirei. They would most likely be the ones to watch out for. Naruto had no clue if winging more than one Sekirei actually meant something, whether it meant the Ashikabi in question had more chakra than most, or if it was just the luck of the draw. However, having more Sekirei under their wing meant they had more firepower to bring down on him and his Sekirei, should they end up battling. And that was really the most important thing to know in this instance. Naruto had 4 Sekirei now, and therefore he probably wouldn't need to worry about Ashikabi with only one Sekirei for a while yet. I can do that, Matsu said, nodding her head as she adjusted her glasses. Though it will take some time to get all of them. I can only access MBI's database once every few days, and even then it's only for a few hours at a time. The hacker looks slightly sheepish as she admitted this. If I spend too much time in their mainframe, they may notice me and change their security. I would still be able to get in, she assured Naruto when he frowned at the news. But it would take a long time for me to hack back into their mainframe. She paused, and then looked at Naruto with a frown. Are you sure you want all of the Sekirei and Ashikabi profiles? Yes, Naruto said. Even the ones who have lost. Naruto blinked, and for a moment wondered what she was talking about before her words sunk in. Of course there were Sekirei who had already lost. Hadn't he defeated Yomi just a few days ago during his rescue of Kusano? If he had beaten his Sekirei, then it was only safe to assume that other Sekirei had fought and lost as well. His thoughts were confirmed when Natsu gave him a nod. Of course, she said. There have been a number of battles so far, though I will need to check the database again to find out how many have happened recently. Nodding to himself, Naruto made his decision. I still want all of the profiles, even on those who lost, he told her, then tilted his head. Also, I want them to be as detailed as possible. I want to know everything you can give me, not just names and statistics and numbers, but also the Sekirei's abilities and powers as well. And for the Ashikabi I want to know more than just who they are, and how many Sekirei they've winged. I want a complete profile, name, residence, occupation, background and history, and if possible I want a complete personality profile. That's a lot to ask for, Naruto-tan, Natsu admitted while looking uncomfortable. His words seemed to have made most of the people in the room distinctly uneasy as well, especially Uzumi who was looking at him with wary eyes. I don't think the MBI database even has that much information. Can you get it anyways? Asked Naruto. If you're capable of hacking into MBI's database, then it should be easy enough for you to hack into MBI's satellites, and use them to spy on the Ashikabi and their Sekirei. Natsu frowned. Well, yes, but... Hey, bro, Uzumi interrupted Natsu from saying anything else as she directed all attention to her. Is it really that important for you to know so much? I mean, I guess I can see the need to be prepared for the Sekirei you may fight, but they're Ashikabis as well. You do know it's against the rules for a Sekirei to kill an Ashikabi, right? She asked, and out of all the people in the room, she seemed to be the uneasiest. And do you honestly think everyone participating in the Sekirei plan is going to follow the rules? Asked Naruto, frowning at the girl when he saw her flinch. Just because it's against the rules doesn't mean people won't do it. Humanity has never cared about following the rules of engagement, nor have they cared about a code of honor while in combat. Perhaps you Sekirei might care, but from what I've seen an Ashikabi's will can subvert that of the Sekirei's, and an Ashikabi is human. There is no telling what lengths they will go to in order to win and claim their prize. Greed, it was one of the most despicable things about humanity as far as Naruto was concerned. Their desire for more money, more prestige, more land, more power, the lengths some people would go to get what they want, and the despicable acts they would commit were limitless. He had once seen a man kill off his entire family, just so he could claim the inheritance from a will that had been split between him and his brothers. The worst part was he hadn't just killed the brothers, but their families as well in an effort to ensure that there was no one to contest him. If people were willing to do that for money, then what would they be willing to do about a prize they had yet to even know about, but one that seemed so full of promises? Naruto could tell you from experience how far they would go. It would be like the Crusades all over again, with every two-bit fool riding on their own coattails, killing and slaughtering all in their path, due to their misguided belief that the land they were fighting for was holy land. In the end, humans were a bunch of idiots with delusions of grandeur, and not a lick of common sense. You don't seem to have a very high opinion of your own species. It was stated as a question, and Naruto turned to look over at the woman who asked it. Miya was once more studying him, analyzing him as if she had just seen him in another light. But there was something else about the way she looked at him, something different that he couldn't place. With a sigh, Naruto felt his shoulders slump a little. I just see things as they are, he replied, wondering for a moment how much he should tell them, before just deciding to plow onwards. Throughout human history, the one constant you always hear about is war. Battle has been constant among humanity. We kill, and kill, and kill. We kill so much that sometimes I think the only thing humanity is truly good at is killing. Always people are coming up with new weapons, easier methods to kill each other with. Rather than doing something useful that would benefit society as a whole and help improve lives, scientists spend more time trying to figure out ways to end it. History had proven this, the biggest example having happened in the year 1945, when the United States had managed to create the atomic bomb, and then used it on Hiroshima during World War II. How much better could they have used their time coming up with something useful, if they had not wasted it all on a weapon capable of wiping out a city? How many problems could they have fixed? How many diseases? They had wasted over $2 billion and the time of the greatest minds in existence back then to create what Naruto believed was a waste of time and effort. And with the invention of the atomic bomb, Pandora's box had once again been opened. Just like during his time where Shinobi tried to learn more and more destructive jutsu, only instead of jutsu people were trying to outdo each other by making more and more inventive ways of killing each other. Bombs, bioweapons, acidic vapors, you name chances where somebody had already made it. It was proof of humanity's greatest failing, and the reason Naruto stopped caring. Why should he bother stopping humans from killing each other when they were so adamant on doing so? Why should he bother preaching about peace when everyone railed on about war? There was no point in trying to stop those who would not stop, nor any point in trying to preach to those who refused to listen. Of course, Naruto had given up on humanity long before the invention of the atom bomb. But the moment he had learned of its existence, it had just been more proof in his mind that he had made the right choice. There was simply no point in saving such a violent and destructive race from their own stupidity. With a sigh, Naruto pushed his plate away and stood up. A clinking of chains let him know that Akitsu was doing so as well. "Sorry for ruining the meal," he said, before making his way out of the room. As soon as Naruto walked out the hall, a depressed sigh escaped his lips. He had no clue what had come over him back there. It had almost been like someone else had taken over. Though perhaps they had in a way. The way he had spoken back there, it hadn't been the words of Naruto the wandering shinobi, or even Naruto the lonely immortal. It had been the voice of one who had seen and participated in wars before, of a man who had seen the worst that humanity had to offer, of a leader whose naive ideals had failed him when he needed them most, causing him to realize the truth of the world. The Naruto that had spoken back there had been the one who had been the only survivor of war, and grown wary and bitter because of it. While Naruto had decided he was going to make a concerted effort in accepting his Sekirei and participating in the Sekirei plan with them, at the same time he was beginning to realize it wasn't just as simple as deciding to do so, and then doing it. He seemed to have a lot more issues than he originally thought, or maybe he had just gotten so good at ignoring them that they no longer registered until they came up, like someone who forgot where their phone was when they weren't using it, even though they had put it in their pocket just moments before, only on a much larger scale. That meant Naruto was really going to have to put in an effort to be less cynical about the world around him, not an easy thing to do. As someone who has lived for so long, Naruto has seen the absolute worst humanity had to offer, and as unfortunate as it was, humanity's worst qualities far outweighed their good qualities. Maybe I should take a page from Usubi's book, he thought with a chuckle. Perhaps his beliefs would change if one day he just decided to start spouting euphemisms on how love triumphs over everything. If nothing else, it would make for an amusing sight. The clink of chains brought Naruto's attention back into focus. He looked over at Akitsu, frowning when he saw she was actually not looking at him for a change. Turning his head to look in the direction she was looking at, Naruto saw the reason for this, and couldn't fault her for being more interested in this than she was in. The person she was looking at was Kagari, and he seemed to be looking worse than he had yesterday, if such a thing were even possible. His once pristine and perfectly creased clothing was in complete disarray. His long-sleeved shirt was untucked and rumpled, with the top 5 buttons undone. Likewise, his pants looked like they had been rolled up into a ball before he put them on, the numerous wrinkles a clear contrast to the dry, cleaned look they used to possess. Even more worrisome than that was the way Kagari was acting, leaning against the windowed hallway as he took increasingly heavy breaths, and held his left arm over his chest. The flush on his face was so red that Naruto thought he might burst into flames at any moment. His half-lidded eyes seemed to look at everything and nothing at the same time. The moment Naruto got a good look at the other man, he began getting a bad feeling. He knew that Kagari was a Sekirei, at least, he was 90% positive that Kagari was a Sekirei on top of being the person he had been seeing in his dreams for the past 2 nights. To top it off, he had seen this look before, in Usubi. And if Kagari's current state was what he thought it was, then Naruto was not sure it boded well for either of them. Despite this, his body ended up moving forward until he was standing in front of the much younger man. "Hey, are you alright, Kagari-san?" he asked, feeling kind of stupid for asking that when it was quite obvious that he was not alright. Kagari just looked up at the sound of his voice, his half-lidded eyes seeming to stare right through him as the red on his face seemed to increase in hue. After only a second of staring at him, Kagari's eyes seemed to roll up into the back of his head, and he fell forward. Shit. Naruto swore as he reacted on instinct, catching the fire user before he fell. In the years to come, Naruto would discover that this moment would be one of the strangest he'd ever had before since. The moment Kagari began to fall forward, his arm left his chest, and Naruto got a good look at just what the man was packing. Of course, when he saw the set of decently sized breasts of Kagari's body, Naruto had to question whether the fire user was a man at all. After all, dudes don't normally have tits, and Kagari was a twig, nowhere near fat, much less fat enough to possess man boobs. Perhaps he was just simply a she, and she had been hiding that fact from everybody else. It was plausible. Naruto had known women who disliked the fact that they were female, mainly due to the prejudice most men had towards the fair gender, and used breast bindings to hide that fact. But that had been back during the medieval and shogun periods mostly. Nowadays women had pretty much equal rights as men. All these thoughts flashed past Naruto's head within the time it took for Kagari to finish falling towards the blonde. Naruto was quick to make sure the male, female, whatever, did not hit the floor, moving deftly to the side where he grabbed the fire user's arm and slung it over his shoulder, before wrapping his arm around the silver-haired Sekirei's waist. Tightening his grip as well as securing Kagari's arm over his shoulder, Naruto looked at Akitsu and began issuing his commands. Akitsu, I need you to get Miya and tell her to meet me in Kagari's room. Let her know that it's urgent. Of course, Ashikabi-sama, she said with none of the hesitation in her voice as she left. It seemed that while the woman may be slow in most cases, Naruto giving her a direct command was not one of them. She turned around and took off post-haste towards the room where they had left Miya. Naruto watched her go, and with a small grimace began making his way towards Kagari's room. Out of all the times for something like this to happen, it just had to happen now. Of course it did. When was anything in his life ever easy? Naruto had always had the worst luck when it came to anything involving situations like this. His first C-rank mission had later on turned into an A-rank mission. During the Chunin exams he had ended up in combat with both a Sannin and a demon container, and during the search for Tsunade with Jiraiya, Naruto had ended up meeting up with Uchiha Itachi and Hoshigaki Kasame, two S-rank criminals that had wanted Kurama's power. And those were just the situations he had run into within the first few months of becoming a shinobi, and that wasn't even mentioning his graduation before that. With all the shit he had been thrown in his life, Naruto really should not be surprised by something like this happening. And yet he was. It seemed that Murphy had decided to throw him another curveball when he wasn't looking. You? Kagari's haggard voice brought him out of his thoughts. Looking towards the fire user he saw the guy with breasts, staring at him with tired yet narrowed eyes. You saw them, didn't you? He asked, and it did not take a genius to figure out what he was talking about. If you're talking about that chest you're packing, then yes, I saw, Naruto stated, deciding it would be better if he just got this situation over with. It was a good thing he had been expecting a violent reaction, otherwise Naruto may have gotten himself a touch burned when Kagari suddenly burst into flames. Naruto was quick to let go of the fire user, and jump back as deep orange fire flared to life around the silver-haired Sekirei. Despite the fact that Kagari's body looked to be covered in flames, they did not hurt him. No? Wait. That wasn't true, Naruto realized as he looked at the fire user's left hand, where the fire seemed to be the most concentrated. It looked red and welted, bubbles had formed on the skin, most likely in response to the intensity of the flames. As Naruto continued to watch, the fire user grimaced for some reason, looking down at his or her left hand, as if he or she were expecting something to happen. Naruto wasn't quite sure what Kagari was looking for, but whatever it was, it didn't seem to be happening. Damn it, Kagari mumbled, just barely loud enough for Naruto to hear over the roar of the flame. Even the fire user's voice was beginning to more feminine. Not now, please not now. This can't be happening right now. What can be happening? Asked Naruto, the sound of his voice making Kagari's head snap up to his so fast it looked like the fire user might receive whiplash from the action. The blonde looked at the man as he stood there on fire, already coming to what he felt was the obvious conclusion. You're reacting, aren't you? Wah? Kagari blinked, his eyes wide in shock. He shook his head, as if trying to dispel his disbelief. Considering he looked even more surprised than before, it obviously didn't work. How did you know that? He winced, then began to hiss in pain as his clothing began to burn. His right hand went to the increasingly large hole on shoulder that was currently being burned away by the fire that surrounded him. Wasn't that hard to figure out, Naruto said, taking a single step forward. He stopped, however, when Kagari moved a step back. Frowning, the blonde stayed put as he decided to answer. Wasn't that hard, he said with a shrug. There are very few people within the world who have silver hair like yours. I had pretty much guessed that you were the guardian of unwinged Sekirei, the moment we met outside of the Arboretum, Kagari. Or is it Hamura? At Hamura, or Kagari's grimace, Naruto made an attempt to take another step forward. However, when the flames around Kagari increased, the blonde decided it would be best to stay put. As for how I knew you were reacting, well, Naruto grimaced a bit. I've been having dreams about you for the past 2 days, much like the ones I had about Kusano when she reacted to me. Even as the blonde continued to speak, his mind was going a million miles a minute as he tried to think of what to do. If Kagari kept his flames up for much longer, Naruto was sure the house was going to start burning. In fact, he was surprised it hadn't already. The first thing Naruto needed to do was find a way to put out the fire surrounding Kagari. He was no longer sure asking the fire user to do so was a viable option. The Sekirei in question did not seem very inclined to stop. He could use a water jutsu of course, but Naruto was not sure how good he would do without a source of water available. While he did have the affinity for the element now, he had not trained in its use since the war, and he had never gotten his training to the point where he could pull water from the moisture in the air. Considering the heat caused by Kagari's flame had likely sucked all the moisture around them out, even if he could use the moisture in the air, Naruto was not sure that was an option anymore. In short, he didn't have very many options available to him at the moment, beyond trying to convince Kagari to stop before Mazen Izuma was burned down. Kagari, you need to turn off the heat, Naruto started, almost taking another step forward before deciding against it. If you don't, then Mazen Izuma is going to become nothing more than ash. I can't. Kagari said in a strained voice. I can't control the flames anymore. Oh, well that wasn't good, Naruto thought to himself. Who the hell was he kidding? This was terrible. And worse still, Naruto was once again at a loss of what the problem was. He had never heard of a Sekirei being unable to control their own powers before. Granted, Natsu had only told him the basics of Sekirei physiology. She had not told him about the specifics behind a Sekirei's power, beyond the fact that the power they had was something they gained through their adjustments. Did that mean something had gone wrong with Kagari's adjustments? Perhaps his power was unstable, or maybe it had something to do with his Sekirei core, which Naruto was assuming was the source of a Sekirei's power. Perhaps the core itself was unstable, but if that were the case, then how did one go about fixing an unstable core? Oh my. Hamura. Naruto's head snapped backwards at the sound of the voice to see Kitsu had done as he asked and gotten Miya, and it seemed everyone else had decided to follow her. The landlady was standing in the middle of the hallway, one hand placed against her mouth not in a sign of amusement, but in one of extreme worry. Despite that, and the shock on her features, she did not seem wholly surprised. Had she known about Kagari's problems already? Uzume and Natsu were also looking incredibly shocked. One stood there with a gaping jaw, her arms slack, while the other was looking on with wide, worried eyes. Even Kusano seemed to be aware of what was going on. As for Musubi. Kagari-san is on fire. What should we do? Well, she seemed to be freaking out like everyone else, only in a much more vocal way. Akitsu. Naruto's voice cracked like a whip. Cool him off. It was a testament to the woman's ability to react under stress that she reacted instantly. The air around Kagari began to cool in spite of the heat, and frost began gathering all around him. The frost was quickly burned away, however, Akitsu seemed to be putting on the power, and more frost began to form. Before long a thick curtain of the stuff had formed around Kagari, then it glassed over into ice that surrounded the fire user on all sides, which soon melted under the intense heat of Kagari's flame. However, the ice had served its purpose. When the fire melted it, the ice turned into water, which poured not only over just Kagari, but the entire hallway, soaking every inch of the hull, and even breaking down some of the shoji screen doors, and shattering a few windows. Naruto used chakra to stick to the ground and grabbed Kusano with his left hand, lifting her up into the air and setting her on his head. The little girl had thankfully grabbed a fistful of his hair, because Naruto had already taken his hand off her, so he could use each one to grab one of his other Sekirei. Musubi and Natsu each found one of his arms around them, pulling them close as a large sheet of ice formed in front of them, and protected the group from getting swept away. A quick glance around showed that Akitsu was directly behind him, safe from harm, and that the ice user had the foresight to put another layer of ice in front of both Miya and Uzume, in order to protect them. It was an impressive display of power and control, and even in the midst of what was happening, Naruto found himself admiring the woman's control over her element. When the water had more or less dispersed, with only a few puddles now staining the soaked tiles, the ice protecting them all melted. Kneeling down in what could be considered ground zero was Kagari. His body and what clothes that hadn't been burned off soaked. He was still breathing heavily, and Naruto could see multiple burns on him, but at least he was no longer on fire. A second later, however, Kagari's eyes rolled up in the back of her head, and the fire user passed out before he hit the ground. Thanks for listening. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you want the next part of this video, like, subscribe and comment down below and turn on the bell notification. And also check out other videos that I have created and enjoy. See you in the next video. Peace.